everybody, Dia Davidson here with another conversation on race. This time we're talking, since it's Derby week, we're talking about the contributions of both Black and Brown to Kentucky's horse industry and, of course, to the Kentucky Derby. Joining me now from the University of Kentucky's Africana and African American Studies Department is Dr. Anastasia Curwood. She is the chair of that department. Welcome.
Hi, welcome. It's good to be here.
Oh, I'm so grateful for your time and for this conversation. It's so timely. I mean, it's a couple of months late, but it's definitely one that we need to talk about. And, you know, not only just because it's Derby week, but because of everything that's kind of going on in our country at this time with regards to race. So let's talk sort of with the present in mind and then move backwards. Latest news, Barclay Tagg made the comment yesterday about the potential protesters in Louisville saying, quote, we are not allowed to shoot them, but they can shoot us, I guess, end quote. And so he got a lot of back stuff for making that comment. Is this just an indication of where we are, even in our horse industry, given the rich contributions that Black and Brown have made and continue to make?
Well, the horse industry is part of the United States, and the United States has a 400-year-long history of, the exploitation of Black people, and then the surprise and anger when Black people even peacefully resist that exploitation. So I'm not surprised that Tagg is unhappy about the protests. He's got a lot of company in that opinion, but unfortunately for us to live up to our ideals of liberty, freedom, and justice, everybody has the right to protest. And to correct him, those who are protesting for the rights of Black Americans, they are overwhelmingly peaceful.
Right, and it's usually those who are trying to stir the pot and get the conversation off of the main point of liberty and justice for, and the key word is all, are coming in and making this this noise, if you will, this anti what the whole protest movement is all about. Mm-hmm. So then let's now go all the way back. We're in the 1800s. We are Kentucky, and we are going to embark on this thing called the Kentucky Derby. And we have our horses. And we have a gentleman by the name of Oliver Lewis. And we have a horse, Aristides. What happened with those two? They made a little history, didn't they?
Yes, you've been doing your homework. So they were brought together by a third individual, a man named Ansel Williamson. And Ansel Williamson was at that point, he had been in Kentucky since at least 1864, when he had been purchased by a man named R.A. Alexander, who was an enslaver. He purchased Ansel Williamson as a slave. And Ansel Williamson was the trainer. So, as you know, even today at the Derby, you have the horse's owner, you have the trainer, and you have the jockey. These days, the horse's trainer is not owned by the horse's owner as well. But
it's considered the same commodity, right?
Correct. Well, so this is the thing, and that first Derby, that was not that was post slavery. So Ansel Williamson was no longer a commodity, but he had been a commodity. And so these first expert horsemen and probably a sprinkling of women. We don't know so much about the women, but I'm sure they were there. These first horsemen, they were owned by the owners of the horses. So the horses and the talent, the human talent, who trained them and rode them, knew their bloodlines, handled them, the stallion managers, all of the people who we see on the beautiful thoroughbred farms all around us today, those were enslaved people. They were Black people, and they were incredibly skilled and talented. So, so that's what happened in that case. Oliver Lewis had come up in an enslaved world, and both of those folks, as you said, they were commodities.
And oftentimes the horses were treated far better than the humans.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, a horse, horses and humans are completely have different sets of rights. Treating a horse, even a human like a horse, as in buying and selling them, is profoundly wrong. It's just not
Right.
something in itself is something that we just can't do. So
And then to
is,
think that they're treated better and fed better than the human that is caring for them is today, I guess, inconceivable. But yet it was a reality.
Yeah. I mean, there we know that, for example, some of those riders. So we hear about jockeys struggling with their weight today, right? Because they have to stay very, very small and very light to make weight on those horses. So in those days, you wanted to keep them very small, and a lot of times they were young boys. And what's a way that jockeys can keep themselves really light? Well, they go in the steam room, right? And they sweat off all that water weight. Well, the best steam room in those days was the manure pile. If you've ever been around a horse farm, manure piles are really hot, right? So they would actually dig a hole in that manure pile, put the young man in up to his neck, so just his head sticking out, and then rebury him, and he would sweat off all that water weight.
You are kidding me.
I'm not kidding you. So that's how they would get those jockeys down to weight. And this is completely compulsory. So, jockeys right now, they're not owned by anyone. They are free agents in a way, in terms of their charge of their own destinies. They own themselves. These young men didn't own themselves. They were coerced labor. And so they didn't have a choice about being buried in the manure pile. It wasn't up to them. They were coerced.
Yet they performed extraordinarily.
Well, that's just it. And so this is one of the things that it's complicated about slavery, because despite the fact of the profound human rights abuses, such as what I just discussed, you could have these really abject, horrible conditions, and yet people continued to assert their humanity. And one of the ways that people asserted their humanity was to be really, really good at their jobs. And I mean, to take pride in their jobs, despite the fact that they were coerced into doing them. They were skilled, and they're like, so some of these folks were, just phenomenal pedigree experts, trainers, and riders, the best. And so they were. I mean, there's no way they would put in amazing performances year after year, despite the fact that they were coerced into doing it and did not have control of their own fates.
So then I guess, Dr. Curwood, I ask you then, what happened? Why is it now that we don't we don't see as
Mhm.
many, or we don't even, quite frankly, we don't even really hear about this particular part of Kentucky's horse history.
Yeah, well, the answer is Jim Crow. So, so I teach, if some viewers might not have heard the term Jim Crow, and I teach my students that Jim Crow had sort of four component parts. It's segregation, which people probably have heard of. It's poverty and economic loss. It's disenfranchisement, the lack of political power. And then the last piece is violence, and the violence kind of holds the rest of it up and makes the rest of it have teeth. So so after the first, I think it's the first 14 of 28, I'm getting my stats wrong, and sports stats people are going to get after me, but you know, about the first 30 years of the Kentucky Derby, about half of the winners were Black, right?
So we're going to call their names. We're going to say Jimmy Winkfield, Isaac Murphy, of course, Oliver
Yep.
Lewis, Alonzo Clayton, Edward Brown. Yeah.
Yes. So a truly great roster. Some of them twice. And yeah, I mean, I just an amazing collection of their records as jockeys. They're in the Hall of Fame. So some of those jockeys are Soup Perkins. Some of those jockeys are still considered the greatest jockeys.
But you were saying Jim Crow, though, kind of put a kibosh.
Yeah. So so Jim Crow was a system that developed over those same 30 years. The Kentucky Derby started about 10 years after the Civil War, so after emancipation, after the end of slavery. So the end of slavery is this point of kind of a brief moment of possibility where maybe we might have had full equality. And instead, we have a closing around a new system of white supremacy. Slavery is the old system of white supremacy. Jim Crow is the new system of white supremacy. And it involves making sure that everybody follows these lines of segregation and lines of political disenfranchisement. And so these jockeys excelling, beating white jockeys, and making good money. Remember the poverty part of Jim Crow. That could not stand. And so all of these jockeys, there was never any moment where all racing authorities said, okay, that's it, no more Black jockeys. It was more like they got forced out, kind of, we call it de facto, by practice. So people would get harassed. People wouldn't get hired anymore. They kind of got blacklisted from tracks. It was a series of informal practices that pushed them out one by one from the tracks. And by the early 1905, the early years of the 20th century, they were gone. And the last of them, Jimmy Winkfield, he was still at the prime of his career. He wound up going to Europe and winning races over in Europe because he was still riding beautifully and on a streak, and so he went over there to win.
And fully embraced, just like musicians.
And fully embraced. Yeah. So he he was sort of rediscovered in the late 50s and 60s here. Like, oh wow, look, here's this Black jockey. Isn't it strange to have to have a jockey who was Black? I mean, the amnesia was so powerful. And your original question about, well, so why do we forget? It's because that idea of Jim Crow, remember, it's an idea of white supremacy, we had to forget in order to justify the way that we were treating Black people. So we had to have this mythology of Black inferiority and Black incompetence in order to have, you know, to have it make sense that Black people were pushed to the back, pushed aside, we're poor, we're not at the ballot box. Why is that? Well, Black people can't do anything. You can't have an example of Black excellence like these jockeys winning, galloping down that track. So that's why the historical amnesia. And we're working really hard on bringing it back. There are in Lexington, there are heroic efforts right now to bring those memories back to the front. Phoenix Rising is a group that is doing an outstanding job of preserving some of this history. Phoenix Rising has some members, including Dr. Yvonne Giles. She earned an honorary doctorate from the University of Kentucky just a couple of years ago. She's been maintaining and advocating for African Cemetery number 2 in the East End. There's also a project at the International Museum of the Horse that museum put in a new permanent exhibition about African Americans in the horse industry. And it's at the very end of the regular exhibition. So you go through the history of the horse and then you get to the end, and there's a really neat interactive exhibit that I recommend for everybody if you're ever at the horse park. And they're also working on a digital exhibit and collection of artifacts that local families can bring to the museum and have scanned and digitized. And so they'll be shared to whoever goes to the website worldwide.
Yeah.
Anyone will be able to access these documents, and they're gorgeous. They're photos and articles, newspaper clippings. It's really, really neat.
Let's go back a second and talk about Cemetery number 2 and how I believe it was Oliver Lewis is buried there, and isn't Isaac Murphy also buried there?
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, please tell, because it was fascinating to me when I was kind of doing a quick read how we could have lost these individuals forever.
Yes, yeah, we really could have. In fact, so the cemetery was so choked with weeds, and I think it might even be worth talking about historic preservation with Dr. Giles at some point on air, because she is so knowledgeable about it. But it's really her will and organizational capacities that have been keeping that cemetery maintained for the last few years. But yeah, it looked like a vacant lot. It was just abandoned. And this who's who of horsemen and women are in that cemetery. What happened, and this is a case of kind of abandonment of Black excellence by the city, when that cemetery was really overgrown and seemingly a vacant lot. Somebody knew that people were buried there in the 70s, because when the Kentucky Horse Park was being built, and the Kentucky Horse Park is an amazing place. It's a wonderful resource for us. The grave of Man o' War was moved from the farm where he had been buried to the Kentucky Horse Park, which makes sense. He's a horse, and his whole body, most horses aren't buried their whole bodies, but his whole body was buried, and he got moved to the Kentucky Horse Park, where people can visit his huge statue. He's sort of this iconic figure. And somebody thought it would be a great idea to move Isaac Murphy, perhaps the greatest jockey of all time, to the horse park next to Man o' War. Well, Isaac Murphy is a human being. Isaac Murphy was buried next to his wife in African Cemetery number 2. And I think somebody must have thought that it would be this great honor for him to be moved from next to his wife
Next to a horse.
to next to a horse in the horse park, because where he was neglected and overgrown and in a Black neighborhood, which, you know, sometimes people think of where, people think of Black neighborhoods as not as worthy of investing in and not as good as, this historical. Yeah. So he got dug up and moved, and there he is. And, I think Dr. Giles has made a really good, she's put a sign there. It says, "Where is Isaac Murphy?" And, his wife's there, but he's not. And I think it's really interesting. It's sad, and it creates a really a compelling conversation for us to have about what do we value in the city, and what would he have wanted, and how can we make sure that we value the people who created the racing industry in this area, as well as
respect. And it's just respect. At the end of the day, it's just respect. So where do we go now? Where we know that there's this history, we know that there's this social issues in the United States now. So where do we go as we look towards the 146th running of the Kentucky Derby? Where do we go from here?
Well, we can start with understanding who we owe a debt to for creating the thoroughbred industry. We know that a lot of the capital came from wealthy white thoroughbred owners and farm owners, but we also know that that wealth was generated by the labor of Black workers. And we also know that the skills that created the thoroughbreds themselves and their wins came from Black laborers. So I think we just need to know that this was at the very least a collaboration, and appropriately appreciate what has been done, and start holding some of these folks up. So, we have Thoroughbred Park downtown. We have plaques all around it that have the names of some of these, founders of the turf, very prominent white men. We need to add some founders of the turf to that, and put some of the other folks that we've been talking about over the last few minutes there, and
teach our children and add it into, when we talk about the horse or we talk about the trainers, talk about these Black and brown people also contributed, and make that a part of the natural conversation, the constant conversation, so that it's not forgotten again.
Yeah. They invented training. I mean, they founded the modern methods of training. So that's absolutely true.
And probably based on things that they brought with them from Africa when they were brought, not by choice.
Well, and actually there's horsemanship in Africa as well. Yeah. And the other thing is that we need to be reintroducing careers in the horse industry to our children. So there's the Legacy Project here in town is doing that. There are other organizations that seek to introduce students in our school systems to the horse industry, to various skills. And there are, I mean, you can use there's so many skills in the horse industry, from being a farrier to being a veterinarian to being an accountant, to bloodstock agents, pedigree experts,
To ultimately being an owner, because we do have Black and brown owners of horses these days.
We sure do. Yeah, and I am one of them, actually. Although I don't own a racehorse, I own riding horses,
Right.
and ride them myself.
But there are individuals who own horses that run at the Derby who are Black and brown, both American and internationals. So that's something for our young people to also know, that they can aspire to be as well.
And it's
Dr.
a lot of fun.
Oh, it is. Dr. Curwood, thank you. We could talk about this for several hours, and I'm sure I'm going to be ringing your phone and Dr. Giles's phone as well, so that we can continue this conversation on the horse industry, horses, Derby, and so much more. Thank you so very much. And thank you so very much for listening in on our conversation on race with regards to horses and Derby. I hope that this has been informative, changing, and also something to think about as we watch this 146th running of the Kentucky Derby and all that is going on in our country and in the city of Louisville this weekend. Until next time, I'm Dia Davidson.